Hello, and a big virtual hello to everyone joining the Road Safety GB Festival of Road Safety 2020. It's a pleasure to be presenting, unfortunately not in person, and I hope that everybody is well. I've been asked to give an overview of the current Transport Select Committee inquiry into young and novice drivers and an update on where that is at. So let's start by just considering what the Transport Select Committee is. It's a cross-party committee nominated by the House of Commons to scrutinise the Department for Transport. It's basically there to hold ministers and the department to account to investigate matters of public concern where there's a need for accountability. So essentially it should be really asking challenging questions of the department and its policies and decision making. The current committee is made up of 11 members, current MPs, 6 of whom are Conservative MPs, 4 Labour MPs and 1 representative from the SNP. Young and novice drivers inquiry in particular actually started in the previous parliamentary session in the summer of 2019. It was reopened on 16th of March and has clearly been slightly delayed through this year due to other reasons. It's essentially there to scrutinise government's actions to reduce the risk of young and novice drivers being involved in road traffic collisions. The committee invited written evidence on 2 things. 1, why young and novice drivers are at higher risk of being involved in a road traffic collision in the first place. And 2, what the government can do to reduce these risks. The reason for calling the inquiry is that the crashes and the overrepresentation of young and novice drivers in Great Britain has continually been an issue and has stagnated over recent years. While they make up 7% of licence holders and on average travel half the distance of all drivers each year, they are involved in around a quarter of injury and fatal collisions on our roads. In this year of data published, there was 354 people died on Great Britain's roads in collisions involving a driver aged 17 to 24. Put another way, almost 40,000 casualties resulted from these collisions involving a young driver. What's important to note is that in fatal collisions involving a young driver, the young driver is fatality in 31% of these, meaning that the remaining, almost 70%, are other road users. And therefore, collisions involving a young driver do not mean that it is just a young novice driver problem. It is a public health concern for everyone who uses the roads. Highest risk times are between midnight and 4 a.m. During the week and through to 6 a.m. at the weekend. Interesting to note that between 2 and 4 a.m. the risk for young drivers is 8 times higher on both weekdays and weekends. The evidence gathering process for the inquiry involved written evidence that was invited that anyone could respond to. Oral evidence sessions, which invited a variety of people from road safety campaigners who have sadly lost people in collisions with a young and novice driver. Elizabeth Watts from the RAC Foundation, Mary Williams from Brake, TRL, myself. In the insurance industry were represented, as were sort of young driver training solutions such as the Under 17 Car Club and motoring services such as the RAC and AA. The Alliance of British Drivers were also invited. They're a small special interest group and another academic expert on social mobility of young people. And the Baroness Vera of Norbiton, who's the Parliamentary Undersecretary for the Department for Transport, and David Buttery, who is the Road Safety Standards and Services Director for Road Safety Standards and Services at the Department for Transport. All of these have given evidence already. The report is not published yet, but would be due, I would expect, towards the end of the year. There was also, partway through, a slightly strange online young driver questionnaire that was also put up on the website and published via Twitter. If we look at the written evidence, we see a vast number of ways in which people believe the safety of young and novice drivers can be improved. This goes from the types of components that you might see in a graduated driver licensing type of scheme to lower alcohol limits, education, off-road training, lots of other types of training, more stringent testing, more learner practice, telematics, increased police presence, through to better public transport, 0 points in the licence and reoffending aspects, better ADI standards, as a perception of vulnerable road users, safer roads, vehicles, new technologies, managing skills of risk management for young drivers, campaigns, enforcement, and addressing distraction. All things that all seem very relevant, but there were some common themes that came through. The most common suggestions were graduated driver licensing or similar type options, such as extended learner practice or post-test training. 69% of the responses directly supported GDL as an approach. A few more would consider it, but had some reservations over social mobility and employment, that sort of thing. 4 specifically did not support GDL as an approach, and 7 presented other options that they thought were important and didn't discuss at all. Other common suggestions included mandatory education within the curriculum, more improved training, more varied and extensive learner practice, lower alcohol limits for new drivers, and telematics. What I think is really important to note here is that this is not an either or. It's not graduated driver licensing or these other suggestions. And in fact, all those who proposed and supported all of these other common suggestions, all of those can fit within a phased licensing framework. And I think that's really important for us to consider, that actually the road safety community could come together to support each other and have a framework that all of these other things can fit around. And that's what GDL is. It is just a framework, but it works. GDL is a licensing system that's designed to complement the natural learning process. It's achieved by encouraging driving experience in safer contexts, gradually exposing new drivers to more complex and dangerous situations over time. Developmentally, this allows the driver to be better prepared for when they're exposed to the full licensing process towards the end, once they've gone through their probationary period. And it allows them to have a lower crash risk at that point. So a phased licensing process therefore protects new drivers from high-risk driving situations whilst developing their skills in safer contexts. This can also result in a delay in licensure, but actually that also brings its own safety benefits. The typical features of a graduate driver licensing framework will include a learner phase, that we currently have, but probably with a minimum learner period or a minimum amount of practice. Sometimes this is associated with completing a logbook as well. The theory and practical tests would be completed as normal, and then a driver would enter a probationary phase where they are allowed everyday solo driving, but restricted from extreme sort of risk events such as driving late at night, as we've seen from the statistics, and driving with similar age passengers. And we know that GDL works because we have 30 years of evidential publications from over 83 jurisdictions that have implemented GDL over this time. In areas where licensing age is 17, like New Jersey and New South Wales, they've seen reductions in the manner of New Jersey, 14% reduction in all collisions and 25% reduction in fatal collisions. This is where the licensing age is 17. New South Wales saw a 40% reduction in probationary driver fatal crashes since strengthening its GDL restrictions. And a recent publication of 10 years evaluation work in Victoria, Australia, found almost 20% reduction in fatal and serious crashes for 18 to 23-year-olds in their first year post-test. Interestingly, the passenger restriction of no more than one peer-age passenger was particularly effective with crashes with more than one peer-age passenger down 70% in the first year post-licence. So GDL is, as I say, only a framework, but it works. And all of these other things that we think are important, like better training, more practice, all of them can be implemented within this framework. If we had implemented a GDL framework with stringent components back in 2005, after GDL was rejected by the DfT in 2004, we could have saved over £3.5 billion to the economy by this time and prevented almost 8,000 killed or seriously injured. If we'd implemented it in 2013, when it was last considered or suggested following a review of young novice driver interventions, we could have prevented over 2,000 killed or seriously injured on our roads and saved almost £1 billion. But GDL is no longer being considered. So whilst last year the Baroness noted that we will look at and research both graduated learner scheme, which is the period up to and when people pass the test, and graduated driver licensing, which will consider driving at night and whether young users can carry passengers. Whilst that was considered last year, it is not anymore. At this moment in time, she gave evidence to the committee, we are not progressing work on GDL. Instead, focusing on the Driver 2020 project, which is a significant bit of research which we believe will give us the evidence to set out what we need to do in the future. Whilst GDL was under consideration for a while, we're not taking it forward at the moment, and also particularly because of the coronavirus pandemic and impact on young people's employment. It was interesting to note that Lillian Greenwood on the committee responded to ask, well, why are you looking for new evidence about alternative interventions and discounting the ones that you know are effective? So it's important to note that Driver 2020 is an extremely important research project that is for the first time conducting world-leading research in a randomised controlled trial to understand the impact of various interventions for young and novice drivers. What's important to note, though, is that all of the interventions being tested within that project could be implemented within a phased licensing framework like GDL. So again, the message is it is not one or the other. It is about finding the best solutions and the best things to fit within. And can we provide a system and a framework for which we can develop new drivers in Great Britain that are as safe as possible. One theme that came out of the committee hearings was a feeling of safety versus freedom. It was interesting to note that MPs on the committee regularly referenced this as a concern of the restrictions that might be posed within the first 6 months or 12 months of post-licence, sort of in a graduated driver licensing scheme. So the nighttime restriction or the passenger restriction. With Hugh Merriman suggesting that young people might find this offensive and that they would understand the risks, but there are risks in every single daily transaction. Carl McCartney MP sort of asked whether graduate licensing could be termed to be the nanny state at work. And do you think it's losing some freedoms for young people? How do you think it stands with people's libertarian stances? Mary Williams, giving evidence, responded, no, I think it's the opposite. I think it's enabling young people to be safe. It's taking enormous amounts of stress off them, their parents and their friends. It's almost certainly not a nanny state. It's the responsible thing to do to save lives. It's a public health issue. Carl McCartney responded, this is all very worthy. I would just say that obviously life is risky. The sense that's coming through is that to improve safety, we need to impinge on people's freedom. And they're actually at this point in time, some politicians seem to believe that the current collateral damage and the casualties that we are seeing at this point in time is a number that is acceptable for the freedoms that we are provided by the motor vehicle. Elizabeth Box put it very succinctly and nicely by saying there is a right to have mobility and freedom. There's also the right for young drivers to be within a system that protects them, given their level of experience. There's the right of parents to have a system that protects their children if they go in with limited experience. And mobility concerns came up as one of the most important things. But what's interesting is that at no point did anyone provide any evidence of GDL systems impacting on mobility and employment in the jurisdictions in which this has been implemented. Clearly, restriction will impact on mobility. That's not in question. However, this is a temporary part of a licensing process where a driver is developing from a novice to become a more experienced driver. Therefore, would we expect that in other areas that someone will immediately go from being a complete learner to being a complete experienced driver? That would be unrealistic. But in driving, we seem to have this concern or this approach that this is okay. It's worth noting that when we look at the evidence around this in jurisdictions that have implemented GDL, we find that young drivers use various means to adapt their travel behaviour to get around nighttime and passenger restrictions. They just do other things. How did they get around before they started driving? Other people gave them lifts. They went with other people. They cycled. They got on the bus. Whatever. They find other ways to do it. And this was found in both rural and urban areas in the US. The vast majority of journeys affected are social. There's no evidence has been found to indicate that GDL impacts the employment of young people. Around 83 jurisdictions have implemented GDL since 1997, and no evaluations have reported that the employment of young people has been adversely affected. A restriction from midnight to 5 a.m. in GB in our study in 2014 suggested that it would impact 2.6% of work-related journeys for 17 to 19-year-olds. Could other ways be found to support these small number of journeys that would be impacted? It's possible that they should, and it should be that actually we're looking at a feasibility study of what impact GDL would have in the UK and how we can adapt things to support those who might be affected by it. Noted there was an online survey that popped up partway through the inquiry. I have a slightly comedy title to this of "Do Turkeys Think Christmas is Unfair in Any Respect?" Because I have to note the type of questioning that was included in this survey. Do you think graduate driver licence would be unfair in any respect? This was an online survey of young drivers, and the answers were yes or no. This is something I wouldn't expect out of Psychology 101 sort of academic sort of university group. It was really quite surprising to see the wording of these questions and a survey of this type being used within a Transport Select Committee inquiry, if I'm honest. If we look at surveys that have been better designed, considering, for example, the RAC survey RAC Foundation survey a few years ago of graduate driver licensing, which found that 66% of British adults showed support for limits on the number of passengers and newly qualified drivers, and around 61% showed support for driving restrictions between midnight and 5 a.m. It also found quite moderate support from young drivers themselves for some of these restrictions. So actually, it's important to note that we can design surveys better than this, and we can get a better reflection. But we might also question why we are asking young drivers whether they think this is a good thing or not. It's very rare in health that you would ask people what they think their treatment should be. It's very common to ask them how treatment might be implemented, or how it might affect them or improve the experience that they go through. But it's very rare for the medical profession to ask the patients what they think the treatment should be, rather than rely on scientific evidence. In summary, I think it's fair to say that this inquiry was not an impartial review of the current state of evidence. Sadly, anecdote, personal preference and poorly gathered opinion have been given equal weight to over 3 days of overwhelming scientific evidence of effect. Safety is mistakenly traded off with freedom, and we have entered a strange debate on how interventions might impact on the ability for someone to have a freedom. And telematics was brought into this as well, and also seen as a big brother intervention. I think this is a really troubling sort of turn of events, that these are the discussions we're having around improving the safety of young and novice drivers in Great Britain. GDL was supported by the majority of written responses, and it remains the only evidence approach to significantly improve young and novice driver safety. all the other suggestions can actually complement a more robust licensing framework. And actually, I would really like to see the road safety community come together. And rather than this be a case of it's GDL or it's something else, actually, let's just discuss a phased licensing framework, because it is the most natural and the best approach to implementing all the good things that we know can improve safety for young and novice drivers and produce safe new drivers into the driving realm. So question 1 of this inquiry was why young and novice drivers are at higher risk of being involved in a road traffic collision. Well, we know this. It's a complex mix of youth and inexperience. What can the government do to reduce these risks? We know this as well. Implement a phased licensing framework while researching most effective approaches for education and training to support the process. I know this will spark some debate, and I look forward to the discussion. I hope this has been informative of an update of the inquiry, and we look forward to the report. I speak about this without knowing what that is going to say. So thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.